Good morning and afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by Rootstock Software. Our last topic was Project Control, a vital ERP tool for many manufacturers. This is the 12th and final webinar in our ERP 101 webinar series. Our topic today is tracking costs using ERP. Moving on to some housekeeping. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees will be on mute throughout the presentation. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Now we'll take a look at our upcoming schedule. Today we'll be covering our final ERP 101 webinar topic, tracking costs using ERP. Discover Rootstock and Succeed with Rootstock, our new monthly webinar series, will debut on July 18th. We will provide more information on these exciting new webinars at the end of today's presentation. I encourage you to follow Rootstock Software on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and more for the latest and most important information about Cloud ERP. Follow Rootstock Software on social media. I would now like to introduce our presenter, David Bush, Senior Manufacturing Consultant at Rootstock Software. David Bush has 30+ years of manufacturing and MRP, ERP systems experience. David was previously at General Microcircuits, Consona Corporation, and Relevant Business Systems. David will now introduce us to our final ERP 101 webinar, Tracking Costs Using ERP. Hi, David.
Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for that introduction. Appreciate it. As we normally do at the beginning of these webinars, we're going to just very quickly go over what we've covered. This being the last webinar, the 12th in this series, we're going to talk about what we've covered in the first 11 episodes. We learned about the ERP system itself, how it handles all aspects of manufacturing, including an introduction to ERP, where ERP came from, how we got to where we are at this point today. We talked about items. What exactly are items? What different categories do they fall into, and how are they used by the ERP system? Then we talked about how to put those items together into a bill of material that is either a sub-assembly or a final assembly that is shippable to your customer. We discussed in another webinar how to take sales orders, what customers are, what important information the ERP system contains about both of them, and how that information is used to provide you with information that you need. And of course, we discussed purchasing or procurement and the use of vendors in the system. We talked about a very important subject, the subject of inventory, what we keep on hand, how we know that those quantities are accurate, why accuracy is so important, and so forth. We discussed shop floor control. That's where routings are set up, the order that you go through in order to manufacture an item, the work centers that those steps are performed in, as well as labor grades and ratings and so forth. We talked about putting those shop floor routings into a schedule and how the system, the ERP system, maintains that schedule for you, letting you know what work centers may be overloaded, which ones are underutilized, and so forth, and allowing you to very quickly and easily move those jobs around. And then, of course, we talked about work orders, the actual job or requirement for manufacturing to build so that you can meet your customers' demands. And We talked about the subset of ERP, the MRP system, how inventory is planned via that system. And then you'll remember we also discussed an optional part of the ERP system, and that is project control, the ability to break out work that you're doing by however you define a project, doing the costing, the purchasing, running MRP, and so forth, all by that project. Today, we're going to actually be looking at something a little bit different from those specifically manufacturing items that we've covered already. We're going to be looking at a very important part of the ERP, and that's the ability to track costs through the manufacturing process. So let's first of all define what tracking costs actually means. We'll start off by saying that it means that we identify the various costs, the different costs that are incurred to supply your product to your customer. So what money do we have to spend in order to get this item shipped to our customer? It would include obviously things like material and the labor that it requires to build those items. May include outside contracting. Suppose you have an outside contractor or vendor and do some of the labor for you. Then something called overhead, something we will be discussing in some detail today. Overhead is certainly can be a very big part of tracking costs. And then there are other direct costs that we will also be discussing. Tracking costs also means capturing those costs in whatever form they take throughout the entire manufacturing process. From the time that they're first incurred, and that may be a little bit of a surprise, until the final costs are identified. So capturing costs begins with the estimate, maybe even before the estimate is created. It continues through the order taking, sales order part, and then of course manufacturing, purchasing the parts, identifying what's needed, recording the labor that's used in the manufacturing process, and then moving those items back into the shipping department where they can be packaged and shipped, and then eventually invoiced. A third part of tracking costs is comparing costs, comparing actual to expected costs. This is very important for future planning. Just exactly how well did we do? Did we make money on this? Did we lose money? And regardless of what the answer is, why did that happen? And how can we get better at accurately predicting what our costs are going to be? And you're going to find out that in Rootstock, we can compare actual costs with expected costs by the order that we're fulfilling. If we use project control, we can do it by project, or we can do it at the division level, even at the company level. So let's take a closer look, examine a little bit more thoroughly what some of those specific costs that we need to capture are. So what types of costs will I both track and evaluate? First of all, we're going to track the material, direct material that is purchased or manufactured specifically for the job that we're working on. We're also going to track the labor that is used in the manufacturing process, again, specifically for the item that we are building to ship to our customer. If we have a need for subcontract labor, perhaps we are unable to do a particular operation or for whatever reason, or maybe it's more cost effective to use a subcontractor, we need to, of course, evaluate and track those costs. But besides these obvious ones, there are some less obvious costs that we also want to capture. For example, machine costs. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. What exactly is a machine cost and how does it fit into tracking costs in our ERP system? And then there's that thing called overhead. Do we consider overhead to be a part of labor, a part of machine cost, or maybe it's both? Well, we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail later on. And then there's indirect material. If you sat in on our webinar on purchasing, you might, and on inventory, you might remember that we discussed indirect material. Material that is purchased in order to keep the manufacturing process going, but not specifically for the order that I'm working on. It may be used on that order, but it's also used on many other orders. So what decisions do I have to make as a company in order to accurately capture the cost and make sure that when I look at the cost, I'm really seeing everything that I need to see? How do we decide how to do that? Well, the very first question that we have to answer is, what method of capturing costs am I going to use? Now, in today's webinar, we're going to focus in on two specific methods of costing. There are others, and there are variations of the ones we're going to talk about, as you will see. The two primary costing methods that are used include standard cost, and standard cost which uses standards to measure profit or loss, and we will define this a little bit further later on. And then there's average or weighted average cost, which is also known as actual cost. So if you keep those two different methods in mind, standard cost and actual cost or average cost, those are what we're going to be focusing on in today's session. And as I mentioned, of course, there are many other methods that are used by different companies, maybe not called exactly these things, but typically they're just a variance of one of these previous options that we have already mentioned. So another thing that must be decided is that kind of sometimes confusing cost that we call overhead. We've got to decide how we're going to handle it. But the first thing we have to decide is, what does overhead mean to me? As in my company, what do I consider overhead to be? And how am I going to calculate overhead so that I can add it, if I desire to my manufacturing cost? Well, let's start with that big question. What exactly is overhead? Well, simply put, overhead is what it costs me to conduct my business that is not directly related to a specific project, order, or item. So again, for those of you who have been with us through our previous webinars, you know that we have used the example of building a bicycle to illustrate inventory needs and work orders and routings and so forth. Think about that handlebar assembly that we have built. The handlebar assembly required certain aspects of the finished product, the handlebar unit, maybe the handles, maybe some other parts. All of those things are direct items, direct costs to build that handlebar assembly. But at the same time, I need many other things in order to build that assembly. I need to have a factory. I need to have electricity and so forth. So all of those have to be considered when I'm looking at what overhead is to me. So overhead can include the utilities that I have to pay anyway to run the building, whether I build something or not. It obviously has to include the wages and the salaries of indirect labor. People that are not working specifically on the item that I'm going to ship to my customer, but are working in order to keep the business going so that I can build and ship product. It also would include office and shop supplies that are indirect items, not directly related to what I'm building, but are required in order to do the manufacturing process. And then there's vacation pay, holiday, and other paid leave time that I've got to consider as a part of my overhead cost. So here's the question. What are you going to do with all of those costs when you're considering the total cost to build a product? Are you going to roll those costs into the cost of goods produced? And if you decide to do so, and I'll say that just about everyone does, how are you going to do that? Let's take a look at what some of the options are for calculating overhead costs. So here's the subject: rolling overhead costs into manufacturing costs. In other words, taking those indirect costs and including them in the cost of manufacturing goods. It's a company decision as to how overhead is calculated and what is included. By that I mean it's not a software decision. The software is going to back up whatever, pretty much whatever your company decides you want to do. Will that overhead be a percent of labor costs? In other words, I could say I pay my employee $10 an hour, and I figure it costs me probably 1.5 times that to keep the factory going. So I could use 150% of my labor cost as overhead. It could be a percent of material costs. If I spend $100 to build this item, I might add 100% or 50% or whatever percent I determine is valid for my company into the cost of manufacturing that item. It also could be a percent of machine costs. Now, machine costs are not used by everyone. They are very important for some people, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a couple of minutes. Is it going to be one of these, or is it going to be two, or some combination of all of these? As a company, I have to decide that. Is it not a part of direct costs? In other words, am I not going to directly include these costs in my direct cost calculations? Although this is a company decision, as I mentioned, the software, the ERP software provides the functionality for each of these choices. And those of you who use Rootstock know that Rootstock is very flexible as to how overhead costs are determined. The Rootstock costing method is determined at the division level. And that's very important to remember, because it means that if you are a multi-division company, each one of those divisions can choose their own options, do their costing however their management feels is best. So we said that there were two costing options, standard cost and actual cost. Let's spend just a few minutes taking a closer look at what those options actually are. So let's start with standard cost. What exactly is standard cost? Well, standard cost is based on a company-identified standard for each item and also for labor, as opposed to using the actual purchased cost or employee rate. So when I'm costing my product, I say, well, I believe the handlebar assembly costs $25 as a standard to make. It may cost me a little bit more, it may cost me a little bit less, but I'm going to use that $25 standard. The standard has got to be reviewed on a regular basis because standards change. Purchase costs go up and down. Labor rates go up typically. And other factors have to be taken into consideration. So people that use standard cost typically review those standards either annually, quarterly, even monthly, and make those adjustments as needed. The ERP system tracks and maintains standard cost and variances. That means here is my standard, $25, but when I built this last 100, it cost me $28 each. So I have a $3 variance. The variance is the difference between my standard cost and the actual cost. And as I mentioned in this slide, purchase price variance, PPV, is a good example of that, where I might have a standard of $10 for a purchased item. This time it cost me $11, so I have a purchase price variance of $1. Of course, the goal that a company using standard cost has is to have as small a variance as possible between your actual costs incurred and what you have set up as a standard. If you have a negative variance, if you look at your variance reports and you see that they're typically coming out negative, that means that what you expected something to cost and what it did cost are not the same. Your actual costs are less than expected. And that means that you're going to be making more money, but it could be at the risk of losing business to lower price competitors. You can be underbid by competitors who can still be making money. not quite as much as you, but really doesn't matter if you don't have the job. A positive variance means that expenses were more than expected. You don't want that either, because that's cutting into your profits. You thought you were going to make $100, turned out because your standards were incorrect, you only made $40, whatever it is. So we want those company using standard costs wants their standard to be as close to actual as possible. Who uses standard cost? Well, it's typically used by companies that do a lot of estimating, because it's much easier to look at variances while a job is active than using an average cost system. It's much easier to build estimates for your customers using a standard cost system. Now let's take a look at the second cost method, and that's actual costing. So what is actual cost? It might be a little bit surprising that actual cost is not necessarily actual cost. We'll find out why. Actual cost is based on the actual cost, the price paid or incurred for the material and labor that is used in the manufacturing process. And actual cost, by the way, is by far the most popular costing method that is used by rootstock customers. It's also known as weighted average cost, where the system maintains an average cost of material going in and out of inventory. So if material comes into inventory at say $1 a piece, and then comes into inventory a little later on at $1.50 a piece, weighted average cost is going to add those together, do the division, and come up with what the average cost is for those items in inventory. We're going to be looking at an example of that in some detail in just a couple of minutes. An actual cost system tracks labor costs at actual employee rates rather than grade rates. So for those of you who sat in on the shop floor webinar, you know that grade rates are what we expect to pay an individual in this grade of employee. Not their actual rates, but an actual cost system uses the actual hourly rate of employees as they report their time. Overhead is pretty much the same whether you use actual cost or standard cost. It's calculated in the same way. It's a percentage of labor, machine, and or material cost, and again, it's defined at the division level. What percent of labor is my overhead? What percent of my machine or my material cost is labor? That definition is at the division level. There is no purchase price variance using actual cost because material goes into inventory at the actual purchase order price. So there is no variance. There's no difference between a standard and an actual. You're only looking at the actual as an average of what you have in inventory. Now, because the actual cost method is the most commonly used by far method for rootstock customers, we're going to focus the rest of our time today on the actual cost method. So let's take a look at how actual cost actually works. If you have a paper and pencil handy, you might want to take it out and use it to follow along in this example. Simple example, well, I hope you think it's simple as we go through this. Our example is going to be part A, which is a purchased item. Our company bought 100 of these at $1 each and has used up 75 of them. There's only 25 remaining in inventory. And those 75 that were used were issued at an actual cost of $1 each. So $75 of material cost went into that job. Part A is purchased at $1 times 25 pieces in inventory, and that equals my actual cost value of $25 in inventory. Now our company needs to purchase 25 more, but the price has changed. It's gone up to $1.50. So the new 25 are received into inventory, and now I have 50 of Part A in inventory, and the total value is the value of the 25 originally there at $1 each, and the new 25 at $1.50 each, for a total of $62.50. That's the result, as I said, of the original 25 at $25 and the new 25 at $37.50. So the weighted average cost of Part A is now $1.25, or $62.50, the total value of my parts in inventory, divided by the number of pieces in inventory, 50 pieces. So I now have an actual cost of $1.25. Were I to issue any of these 50 pieces to a work order, they would be issued not at $1 as these original 75 were, but at $1.25. So remember, when you're using the actual cost method, actual cost is always determined by the value of the parts you have in inventory plus the value of any new parts that are added, and then that total is divided by the total number of parts that you now have in inventory. We're going to complicate this just a little bit more. Let's see what happens when a little bit more activity takes place with this Part A. Remember, at this point, we have 50 of them in inventory at a value of $1.25 each. So my total inventory value for Part A is $62.50. Now we're going to issue 10 of them to a work order. And remember, those 10 are being issued at that value, $1.25. But we're going to receive 100 more at a new purchase order price. So after issuing those 10 at $1.25 each, we only have 40 in inventory now with a total value of $50. That's 40 times the $1.25 value that we had in inventory. On our new PO, our purchasing agent did a great job. They bought these parts for 90 cents each for 100 pieces, or a total of $90. This brings our inventory value up to $140. That's $50 from the original 40 in inventory, remember at $1.25 each, plus another $90 from the new purchase order receipt. So the new per piece value is going to be the total of Part A's in inventory, now 140, divided by that total value, which also is $140, or $1 each. My weighted average cost has gone down by 25 cents each, and that reflects the lower price, that 90-cent price I paid for the new 100 pieces, but it still considers, of course, the older, more expensive pieces already in inventory. So you notice my price or cost each didn't go down to 90 cents to reflect what my latest purchase order cost, but rather it's a combination of my existing cost plus the new cost that gives me my newest per piece unit cost. So any of these 50 that are issued to a work order will be issued at $1 each. I said earlier that the term actual cost isn't quite right. It's not really exactly accurate because weighted average is closer to reality. Now, having said that, that's using the most simplistic method of costing in rootstock. It is possible to maintain the actual cost, actual purchase cost or manufactured cost of items using project control or other methods that the software allows. But for our purpose today, in general, actual cost is really a weighted average, as this example that we've just gone through shows. Now, let's see how rootstock helps you to follow the costs on a specific work order. I've created a work order, DJB1, and you'll notice it is for 250 of that handlebar assembly, 1017, that we have discussed in previous webinars. This work order is at status firm, status 2, which means absolutely nothing has happened except for the MRP system realizes that I'm going to eventually build these 250 pieces, and so I need the material and labor and so forth that it requires. If I go to the total cost tab on the work order, I can see all of the different types of costs that it is going to track for me. It's going to track my direct material and labor, my material overhead and labor overhead and fringe overhead and machine overhead, as well as subcontract material and subcontract labor, depending on how I have set the flags on the system. I'm going to see charges. Charges being money that is moved into work in process or WIP. I'm going to see deductions. That is the value of what is taken out of WIP, either as finished goods or scrap. And under the actual cost system, I'm going to either see 100% variance or I'm going to see no variance, as you will see as we go on. Let's look at this same work order after I have issued some material to it. Now, I'm still looking at the total cost tab. I can see my material cost at $2,687.50. That's what's gone into work in process. I have no deductions because I haven't taken anything out of work in process. And because I didn't have any standard costs, I didn't tell the system what to expect, I have 100% variance at this point. This means absolutely nothing to me under a cost system. I'm not going to be tracking variances. If you go down to the lower part of the work order screen, you will see that the specific work order components that have been issued are there for me. So I can track this all the way back to the specific part number. But you notice that so far I only have material costs. So let's see what happens when we add labor to our cost. So now some labor has been reported, and you'll notice I have operation costs for labor, $48 of labor costs, and this is direct labor. So an employee has charged enough time to come up to $48 worth of cost. It also tells me that I have labor overhead charged to this job. This is 150% of my labor cost, so that's how it was set up at this division level, that overhead is going to be charged to my work order at the rate of 150% of labor. So there we can see a total operational cost of the $48 and the $72, or $120 total. How does this look, though, when all of the operations are complete? Well, we're still on that work order. We're going to look at total cost again. My material costs haven't changed because I issued all the material to the work order right in the beginning. Now I have deductions because those items, this is now receipts have been completed. So all the items I built have been taken out of WIP, deducted from WIP, and so all the material cost is now gone. And the same thing is true with the labor and the labor overhead. So the point is that Rootstock is giving us a very, very easy way to see my up to the second costs at the work order level. My total charge is appearing on the bottom of the screen, and you'll notice that now it reports no variance at all. 250 assemblies went into inventory at a total cost of $6,255, or 25.02 cents each. Custom reports are used, of course, throughout Rootstock. So custom reports can be defined to give you the specific manufacturing cost information you want. And I just took a screenshot of one of the canned reports that come with the system showing this particular work order that we've been working on down here. We also can look at costs at the project level, as I mentioned earlier. So here is the project workbench that allows me to see the specific costs that have gone into the project that I'm interested in looking at. And it gives me all of the detail that I might want, with the ability to drill down and see the specific detail for any one of these numbers. So that kind of covers the costing methods, of course, at a very, very high level. Let's review what we have talked about today, though, in this costing webinar. First of all, we learned that collecting and tracking costs is a vital aspect of the ERP system. We need to know if we're making money on these jobs or if we're losing our shirts. The methods that we can choose to track costs include a standard cost system, where you establish a standard cost for each item and then compare the standard to actual using variances. Or you can choose the average cost, weighted average, actual cost system, where it uses a weighted average purchased and manufacturing cost of inventory to establish the current value of the parts, and the current value is the actual money, dollars, that have been spent to create those items or purchase those items. And we learned that in the rootstock system, the most commonly used by far is the average cost system. Rootstock work orders that we looked at provide up-to-the-moment costing information, and that includes the material, labor, machine, and overhead costs. And a report writer is used to create user-defined costing reports. So accurate costing information, it doesn't really matter which method you use. That information identifies areas where you might be able to make some improvements. Maybe instead of using your inside labor, it's better for you to use outside labor. Maybe there's some issues that you can see coming up in the future that these reports and costing information makes clear to you. The overall profitability of your company is really at stake. Well, from here, we've covered the basics so far of manufacturing. The ERP system, MRP system, creating bills of materials and purchasing material, creating a demand for items through our sales order system, building sub-assemblies and final assemblies using routings and shop floor scheduling, and using the basic planning tools that are used by all ERP systems, material requirements planning. And we've also discussed in the past the use of project control when you want to define projects and track projects and inventory and so forth at that level. And then, of course, today we've discussed manufacturing cost tracking. This actually is the last of our ERP 101 series, but Rootstock is very happy to let you know that our monthly series is going to continue with actually two different names. One is Discover Rootstock and the other is Succeed with Rootstock. And you'll be getting a little bit more information on that today. For example, our first webinar, Succeed with Rootstock, is going to give us a Rootstock user, Pro Tech, who will show us how they replaced their old system of spreadsheets and old software with Rootstock and the amazing effect that it had on their business. And that's going to take place on July the 18th. The Discover Rootstock series that you will see in our schedule of events coming up is going to show you how Rootstock offers options that you may not be aware of, how you can better use the system to control your own business. And I think you'll find those webinars to be very, very interesting and very helpful. So now I'd like to turn the session back over to our moderator, David Cosgrove. David?
David, thank you so much. Another great job. As David just mentioned, our first Discover Rootstock and Succeed with Rootstock webinar is going to take place on July 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And the title is going to be Succeed with Rootstock, ProTech Replaces Spreadsheets and Old Software with Rootstock. Just reiterating what David covered there. You will all receive an invitation to this new series shortly. The focus of the new Discover Rootstock monthly webinar series really is about top manufacturing pain points and how to solve them, what makes Rootstock unique. Periodically, we will invite a customer to tell their story. These customer-led webinars will be called Succeed with Rootstock. We're really looking forward to seeing you all on July 18th for this can't-miss new webinar series. Moving on now to our Q&A session. Before we go to your questions, just a quick reminder that this webinar will be posted on our website at www.rootstock.com. And of course, after the webinar, if you have any further inquiries, please email us at marketing@rootstock.com. Okay, David, we'll now answer questions submitted during today's presentation, as well as taking any new questions. And just a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. David, we have a couple questions here. Our first question today is, what is the reason for having employee grade rates when using an actual cost system?
The employee grade rates in an actual cost system are typically used for estimating purposes. Since I don't know who exactly is going to be doing the work and what they're going to be paid at the time, I use grade rates to establish what I guess the labor is going to cost me, and that way it doesn't hold up getting an estimate to a customer.
Okay, excellent. We have another question here. What is the purpose of machine cost, and when would it be used?
Actually, I promised earlier I was going to talk about that, and I kind of glossed over it. But in some manufacturing situations, a specific machine may need to be purchased in order to handle a customer's order, or a machine that's already been purchased is extremely expensive to run. In situations like that, the cost of that machine, of running the machine or purchasing it, or maybe both, can be considered part of the overhead that needs to be added to the direct costs to manufacture the item for my customer. So that's why I would maintain machine costs and track how much it's costing me, maybe in electricity or some other means of tracking it that's over and above what I normally would expect to pay for machinery.
Excellent. Okay. David, we have one more question here. Is it better to include more items in overhead, or is it better to view them as direct costs and inventory them?
Well, that's a question I really can't answer, because that's a question each individual company has got to answer for themselves. When the decision is made as to how to handle overhead, what makes up overhead is a big part of that. So in my career, I've worked with companies that don't consider overhead at all, and I've worked with companies that consider just about everything except actual direct cost, labor and material, as overhead. You just have to kind of go through that yourself and work it out, but know that Rootstock will support whatever decision you make along those lines.
Excellent. Okay, David. Well, that wraps up our Q&A session for today. And before we end today's webinar, I'd like to present a brief look ahead at the upcoming topics in our new Discover Rootstock and Succeed with Rootstock webinar series. Please join us on July 18th, 2017 for Succeed with Rootstock. ProTech replaces spreadsheets and old software with Rootstock. Registration will be available in your follow-up email that you will receive. I encourage you all to follow Rootstock Software on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and more for the latest and most important information about Cloud ERP. Follow Rootstock Software on social media. Thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on July 18th. Today's webinar is now over.